The butler did it. Say those 4 words to almost anyone who has ever read a mystery novel, watched a detective drama, or played a board game in a drafty English living room, and they will know exactly what you mean. It is the most famous cliché in the history of crime fiction. The shorthand for lazy plotting. The punchline of 1,000 parodies. When someone wants to mock a predictable whodunit, they do not need to explain, they just say it. The butler did it. But here is something that will fundamentally change how you understand both detective fiction and the real criminal history of Victorian and Edwardian England. Almost no Golden Age detective novels actually used it. The phrase became a cliché before it was even a trope. By 1930, critics were rolling their eyes at it. By 1933, Damon Runyon was parodying it in a short story. And yet, if you sit down with the British Library crime classics, the most respected republication series of Golden Age detective fiction in the world, and look for the guilty butler, you will find that he almost never appears. The convention that Golden Age detective fiction is most famous for is one that Golden Age detective fiction almost never employed. And here is where it gets genuinely dark. While the novelists were busy ensuring that the butler was the most protected figure in the fictional household, too obvious, too easy, too far beneath the notice of a fair puzzle, the real criminal justice system of Victorian and Edwardian England was doing something almost exactly the opposite. In reality, when murder or theft occurred in a house with servants, suspicion fell on those servants immediately, automatically, and with a force that was often completely disproportionate to the evidence. The real investigation did not protect the servant. It targeted them, and as usual 3 questions to think on. 1. Where did the butler did it actually come from? And why did it become a cliché built on almost no actual examples? 2. What did the Golden Age detective novelists really do with servants in their fiction, and what does it say about the class structure they were writing within? 3. When real crimes happened in real Victorian households, what actually happened to the servants, and how does the case of Kate Webster, the Richmond murderess of 1879, expose everything that the fiction refused to show? Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime from around the world, told with the detail and care it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. To understand this, we have to go to 2 places at once. To the country houses of Golden Age detective fiction, and to a small cottage in Richmond, Surrey, in the spring of 1879. The country house and the people in it. The country house mystery is the spiritual home of the British Library crime classics. Picture it. A large house, substantial, probably Edwardian or late Victorian, set in grounds. A weekend party of guests. A library with a fireplace. A dining room where the table is set with precision. And somewhere in the background, moving through the corridors with an efficiency that the guests barely register, the servants. There is the butler, the senior male servant, responsible for the wine cellar, the silver, and the presentation of the household to the outside world. There is the housekeeper. There are footmen, parlour maids, kitchen maids, the cook, the lady's maid, the gardener, the chauffeur. In a large Edwardian household, you might have a dozen or more people employed below stairs. And then someone is murdered. The Golden Age detective novel, the genre championed by writers like Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and the many others whose work the British Library crime classics have brought back into print, is built around that moment. The discovery. The gathering of suspects. The detective. The puzzle. What it is built around just as definitively, but far less often discussed, is who the puzzle excludes. The rules they wrote, and what they revealed. In 1928, an American art critic and detective novelist named S.S. Van Dine published a document called 20 Rules for Writing Detective Stories. Rule 11 is the one that concerns us here. Van Dine wrote that a servant should never be the culprit. Not because servants are above suspicion in the moral sense, but because choosing a servant as the guilty party was an easy solution, beneath the dignity of the puzzle. The culprit must be a decidedly worthwhile person, one that wouldn't ordinarily come under suspicion. Think about what that sentence means. Van Dine is saying that servants, in the world he and the Golden Age writers inhabit, ordinarily do come under suspicion. The fictional convention was to override that instinct in the service of a fairer, more interesting puzzle. Meanwhile, outside the pages, the instinct was never overridden at all. The servants themselves, who were they? At the peak of domestic service in Britain, around the 1880s and 1890s, there were approximately 1.5 million people employed as domestic servants in England and Wales. The vast majority were women. Many were young. Most had come from rural areas or from Ireland. A live-in servant in a middle-class Victorian household worked between 14 and 16 hours a day. They had little to no privacy. Their mail could be inspected. Their visitors were controlled. They lived inside the same walls as their employers, but occupied a different world. The employer could dismiss a servant without notice, without a reference, and without reason. A servant dismissed without a reference was, in practice, unemployable. The threat of dismissal was the primary mechanism of control. This is the world that Golden Age detective fiction placed at the center of its stories, and then, for the most part, declined to fully examine. The trope that never was, the literary history. The phrase, "the butler did it," is most commonly attributed to Mary Roberts Rinehart, and specifically to her 1930 novel The Door. But the phrase does not appear in The Door. Rinehart never wrote it. The association came from public perception of the novel, not from the text itself. By the time The Door was published in 1930, critics were already treating the butler as culprit as a tired convention. A Life magazine reviewer in 1926 noted that readers automatically suspected the butler from the opening pages of any mystery. Damon Runyon satirized it in 1933. How many novels actually used it? Very few. Arthur Conan Doyle's 1893 Holmes story, The Musgrave Ritual, features a criminal butler, but he dies rather than commits murder. Agatha Christie's The Adventure of the Italian Nobleman uses a valet, not a butler. In three-act tragedy, Christie does have a butler figure as the culprit, but in disguise. The real source of the trope, according to the most thorough research done on the subject, was not novels at all. Between 1915 and 1922, at least 16 silent films featured criminal butlers. The public saw it on screen, repeatedly, and when they came to the novels, they brought the assumption with them. The butler did it. On film. 16 times. And the novels got the blame. S.S. Van Dyne's class system in plain view. When Van Dyne wrote that the culprit must be a decidedly worthwhile person, he was making a class judgment disguised as a literary one. The victim is always worth something. The detective is worth something. The murderer must also be worth something, or the puzzle loses its dignity. The servant is furniture. Necessary, ubiquitous, invisible. Always in the background. Rarely at the center. The British Library Crime Classic series has, in recent years, done valuable work in recovering writers who pushed against these conventions. But the dominant tradition operated within a class structure so rigid that it had been turned into a formal rule. Richmond, Surrey, March 2, 1879. While the Golden Age novelists were 2 decades away from establishing their fictional conventions, the real Victorian world was producing something that those conventions would never quite accommodate. It is a Sunday afternoon in early March 1879. A small cottage in Park Road, Richmond, a respectable suburb in Surrey, southwest of London, is occupied by 2 women. One is Julia Martha Thomas. She is in her mid-50s, twice widowed, a former school teacher, and the owner of the cottage. She is known to her neighbours as eccentric, sometimes difficult, given to travel without warning. Her last diary entry will read simply, "Gave Catherine warning to leave." The other woman is Kate Webster. She is 30 years old, Irish-born, and has spent much of her adult life in and out of prison for theft and larceny. Thomas has given Webster notice. Her final day is meant to be February 28. Webster persuades her to stay 3 more days, until March 2. It is the last act of persuasion Webster will need to perform. What happened in the cottage? When Julia Thomas returns from church on the afternoon of March 2, what happens next is one of the most violent and methodical acts of concealment in Victorian criminal history. Kate Webster attacks her employer. The precise sequence, whether she threw Thomas down the stairs first, or struck her with an axe, or a combination of both, was disputed at trial and has never been fully settled. What is documented is the outcome. Julia Thomas dies. And Kate Webster, faced with a body and a cottage and the absolute necessity of not being caught, makes decisions that are as cold-blooded as anything the Golden Age novelists ever put on the page. She dismembers the body. She boils the remains in the laundry copper, the large metal vessel in the kitchen used for washing clothes, to reduce them to something transportable and, she hopes, unidentifiable. She puts the larger portions into a wooden box and a bag. She goes to the pub, hey-ho's, around the corner, while the boiling continues. When she returns, she cleans the kitchen. The following day, she places Julia Thomas's bones in the fire. She sells the gold dental bridgework at a pawnbroker's. She reportedly attempts to sell jars of fat, described as best dripping, to a local publican and to neighbours. She puts on Julia Thomas's clothes. She introduces herself to people as Mrs. Thomas. The body in the Thames. On March 4, Webster visits her old neighbours, the Porters, in Hammersmith. She is wearing Julia Thomas's silk dress. She invites them to a pub, and on Richmond Bridge, drops a heavy wooden box into the river. Parts of Julia Thomas's remains are found in the Thames at various points over the following weeks. The foot is found on a rubbish heap in Twickenham. The majority of her body is recovered from the river near Barnes. Her head is not found. Not for 131 years. In 2010, during building works at a property next door to the murder site, a property owned by the naturalist Sir David Attenborough, a skull was unearthed. Carbon dating places it in the late Victorian era. The skull has fracture marks consistent with Webster's account of throwing Thomas down the stairs. Its collagen levels are consistent with having been boiled. In 2011, a coroner formally identified it as Julia Martha Thomas. A verdict of unlawful killing is recorded, superseding the open verdict of 1879. More than a century after Kate Webster went to the gallows, the last piece of Julia Thomas was found. The investigation closes in. While Webster is impersonating Julia Thomas, the neighbours begin to notice. The woman calling herself Mrs. Thomas does not seem quite right. Questions are asked. On March 18, 1879, Webster's name was formally connected to the investigation. She flees to Ireland, to her uncle's home in County Wexford. She was arrested on March 29 and returned to London. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in July 1879. The courtroom is packed. Before the verdict is even returned, Madame Tussauds has begun preparing a waxwork of Kate Webster for the Chamber of Horrors. The presumption that servants did it, in real life. The Kate Webster case is the most dramatic real example of servant crime in the Victorian era, but it is not the only one, and the pattern it represents is important. The real investigative practice of Victorian and Edwardian England, when a crime occurred in a household with domestic servants, looked nothing like the detective novels. In the novels, the detective arrives and begins careful elimination of suspects. In reality, the initial presumption was almost invariably that the servants were involved. Court records from the Old Bailey and the assizes across Victorian England show a consistent pattern. When theft occurred in a household, the servants were questioned first, their rooms searched first, their characters investigated first. When violence occurred, their relationships with the victim were scrutinized first. The servant who appeared calm was suspicious. The servant who appeared distressed was suspicious. The servant who had left employment shortly before a crime was suspicious. The servant who had any prior history of dishonesty, even minor, was suspected of far more serious offences. The first reversal: the fiction protects the very people reality suspects. The Golden Age detective novelists established a formal convention that the servant could not be the culprit. The puzzle required a more interesting answer. And yet, the same class that produced these readers and writers was operating a domestic employment system in which servants were among the most economically vulnerable and legally unprotected people in England. The fiction exonerated them symbolically. Reality gave them almost nothing. When a servant was guilty, and sometimes they were guilty, the investigation had no difficulty reaching that conclusion. The fictional convention protected the servant from fictional accusation. The real convention questioned them first, always. Kate Webster's trial, the anti-Golden Age murder. The trial of Kate Webster is, in many ways, the anti-Golden Age murder. In a Golden Age novel, the investigation would have proceeded through careful sifting of evidence. Webster's trial did not require that level of methodology, because Webster had done almost everything to implicate herself. She had attempted to sell the remains. She had impersonated the victim. She had fled to Ireland. A witness later testified that 5 days before the murder, Webster had boasted of intending to sell goods she would come into possession of, goods that turned out to match exactly what she stole from Thomas. The jury did not need to deliberate at length. The case was open and shut in a way that the Golden Age novelists would have found narratively unsatisfying and forensically undemanding. The second reversal, when the bias pointed the wrong way. The Victorian and Edwardian criminal justice record contains case after case in which servants were accused and prosecuted on the basis of presumption and circumstantial evidence. A theft in a household. The servants are questioned. One cannot account satisfactorily for their movements. Their room is searched. A small amount of money is found, their own savings, but the amount is suspicious. They have no family member to speak for them. No reference. No lawyer. They are convicted. This is not a hypothetical. This is the pattern documented in the Old Bailey proceedings across the Victorian period. Structural vulnerabilities that made servants disproportionately easy to accuse and disproportionately difficult to defend. The third reversal, the class the fiction built its world around. The country house mystery is set in a world of immense social privilege. The servants in these novels function primarily as sources of information, as witnesses, as atmospheric detail. They observe. They overhear. They report. They are always in the background, anticipating the guest's every need, present in every room and visible in none. What the fiction almost never does, and this is the gap that separates it most completely from the reality of the period, is give the servants interiority. We do not know what the butler thinks about the family he serves. We do not know what the cook feels when she is questioned about the death of her employer. We do not know how the parlour maid experiences the detective's methodical examination. The real servants had inner lives. The fiction gave them duties. At this point, let us pause and reflect. I want to ask you something directly. At this point in the story, we have established that the Golden Age novels almost never used the butler convention. We have established that real Victorian investigations were heavily biased towards suspecting servants. And we have examined the most extreme real case of servant crime in the Victorian period. When you think about the country house mysteries you have read or watched, how many times did you notice the servants were being overlooked? And does knowing what the real investigative world looked like change how you read those stories? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because the answer says something important about what fiction does to the stories it tells, and the stories it refuses to tell. Why the fiction protected the servants, and what that really means. There is a temptation, having established everything in this episode, to read the Golden Age convention as straightforwardly elitist, a fiction that protected the class it belonged to by eliminating servants from suspicion and directing guilt upward. That reading is not wrong. But it is not complete. S.S. Van Dyne's rule against using the servant as culprit was not just a narrative preference. It was, in its own way, a recognition that the real investigative world pointed at servants too readily. By excluding them from the fiction, the writers were, perhaps unconsciously, building a world in which the presumption of guilt did not immediately settle on the most vulnerable person in the room. This is not a defense of the class structure that produced these novels. But it is a complication of the simple narrative that the fiction is just upper-class self-interest dressed up as puzzle-solving. Kate Webster, who she actually was. The question of who Kate Webster was is one that the Victorian press had very little interest in exploring carefully. She was Irish, which, in the press coverage of 1879, was itself a kind of explanation. She was described as gaunt, repellent, and trampish-looking, language that tells you more about the expectations of the reporters than about the woman herself. She appeared calm in court, which was suspicious. She was tall and physically strong, which was considered unfeminine and therefore suspicious. What the press description obscures is worth recovering. Kate Webster had spent most of her adult life grinding poverty, moving between domestic service positions and petty crime, spending time in prison, raising a child largely alone. None of this is offered as mitigation for what she did. The murder of Julia Thomas was premeditated, and the disposal of the body was methodical and cold. But the Victorian press's treatment of Webster as barely human tells us as much about what Victorian society needed to believe as it does about who Kate Webster actually was. The real story is of a woman who had been failed by every structure that might have supported her: employment, legal protection, social safety, and who made, in desperation and calculation, catastrophic choices. The reframing insight, what the fiction and reality share. The Butler did it trope, the cliché that defines a genre, was never really about butlers. It was about trust. In a world where your house was full of people you did not entirely know, people who had access to your food, your medicine, your wine cellar, your private correspondence, your bedrooms, the question of who you could trust was not abstract. It was daily. It was intimate. The detective novel addressed this anxiety by making the answer always someone you knew, someone in your social world, someone who could be comprehensively motivated. The servant was excluded not just because it was too easy, but because giving the servant the answer would have made the anxiety worse, not better. If the butler did it, then every household in England was a crime scene waiting to happen. If the butler did not do it, if the detective always found the answer among the guests, among the family, then the anxiety could be managed. The house was safe. The order of things could hold. Kate Webster killed Julia Thomas partly because Thomas had given her notice. Because she was about to be unemployed, without a reference, without prospects, in a city that had very little use for a woman with her history. The fiction was not interested in that story. The fiction was interested in passion and secrets, and the revelation of darkness beneath a respectable surface. But the darkness beneath the respectable surface was not always where the fiction placed it. What the British Library crime classics actually give us. The British Library Crime Classic series has done something genuinely valuable, and I want to be clear about that before I close. The series preserves fiction that takes seriously the question of how mystery works, how evidence accumulates, how testimony can be trusted or not, how the apparently obvious can mislead. The best of these novels, the Carr, the Brand, the Sayers, the Christie, are not just puzzles. They are thought experiments about the nature of proof. The genre is more interesting than its clichés. And the British Library Crime Classic series is the best available evidence for that proposition. The legacy of Kate Webster. Kate Webster was hanged in 1879. She was buried in Wandsworth Prison, the only woman ever hanged and buried there. Her case influenced the coverage of domestic crime in Victorian England for decades. It sharpened the cultural anxiety about servants that the Golden Age novelists would later channel into their country house settings. And it did something else, which is worth noting. It kept Julia Thomas's story mostly out of the picture. Julia Thomas, the widow who was murdered, dismembered, and disposed of in the River Thames, is almost always a secondary figure in accounts of this case. The case is called the Kate Webster case. The drama belongs to the murderer, her audacity, her impersonation, her flight. The Golden Age detective novel would have centered Julia Thomas. It would have given her a history, a network, a set of relationships that the detective could trace. It would have made her death the starting point for a story about understanding. What actually happened was that her skull lay buried in a garden for 131 years. What the butler did it actually means. The phrase has survived because it captures something true about a certain kind of anxiety, even if it describes almost no actual novels. What it actually captures is this: in a closed world of apparent order and civility, somebody did it. And the question of who contains within it all the tensions of that world, the class divisions, the power asymmetries, the domestic intimacies, the surface of respectability over the pressure of concealed motive. The butler, as a figure, is the keeper of that surface. He maintains the order. If he did it, if the person whose entire function is the preservation of order is the one who destroyed it, then nothing in the ordered world is reliable. That is why the phrase stuck, even without the novels to support it. It points at the deepest anxiety of the entire genre. What remains? The country house still stands, in the detective novel. The detective is still explaining, in the library, with all the suspects assembled. The butler is in the corner, present, attentive, Professionally invisible, not the answer. The cottage in Richmond still stands too. The site where the laundry copper once burned. The bridge from which the wooden box was dropped. What the British Library Crime Classics gives us is the puzzle, beautifully constructed, fairly played, resolved at the end of chapter 20. What the real case files give us is the remainder. The things the puzzle cannot account for. The conditions that produce crime. The people the fiction made invisible. The severed head that spent 131 years in a garden. The butler did it is a cliché built on almost no evidence. But the anxiety that produced it, the question of who, in the ordered world of the country house, could not be trusted, that was real. And the answer, in reality, was almost never the butler. It was the world itself. The pressures it created, the people it used up, the spaces it left with no flaw. The fiction gave us a puzzle. The real cases gave us that. Subscribe to Enter the Crime and tell us in the comments, did you ever suspect the butler? And knowing now what real Victorian investigations looked like for the people below stairs, does it change how you read the classics?